On September 15th, the weather was ideal for flying. I left the aerodrome at 8:30 in the morning on a voluntary patrol, taking the nearest air route to the lines. I had reached an altitude of 16,000 feet by the time I had reached the trenches. The visibility was unusually good. I could see for miles and miles in every direction. I was flying alone, with no idea as to whether other planes of our own were cruising about this sector or not. But barely had I reached a position over no man's land when I noticed a formation of 6 enemy Fokkers at about my altitude coming towards me from the direction of Conflans. I turned and began the usual tactics of climbing into the sun. I noticed the Fokkers alter their direction and, still climbing, move eastwards towards the Moselle. I did not see how they could help seeing me, as scarcely a mile separated us. However, they did not attack, nor did they indicate that they suspected my presence beyond continuing steadily their climb for elevation. 3 complete circles they made on their side of the lines. I did the same on my side. Just at this moment I discovered 4 Spad machines far below the enemy planes and some 3 miles inside the German lines. I decided at once they must belong to the American 2nd Fighting Group, at that time occupying the aerodrome at Souilly. They appeared to be engaged in bombing the roads and strafing enemy infantry from a low altitude. The Spads of the 2nd Pursuit Group had but recently been equipped with bomb racks for carrying small bombs. The leader of the Fokker formation saw the Spads at about the same moment I did. I saw him dip his wings and stick down his nose. Immediately the 6 Fokkers began a headlong peak directly down at the Spads. Almost like one of the formation, I followed suit. Inside the first 1,000 feet, I found I was rapidly overtaking the enemy machines. By the time we had reached 5,000 feet, I was in a position to open fire upon the rear man. Not once had any of them looked around. Either they had forgotten me in their anxiety to get at their prey, or else had considered I would not attempt to take them all on single-handed. At all events, I was given ample time to get my man dead into my sights before firing. I fired one long burst. I saw my tracer bullets go straight home into the pilot's seat. There came a sudden burst of fire from his fuel tank, and the Fokker continued onwards in its mad flight, now a fiery furnace. He crashed a mile inside his own lines. His 5 companions did not stay to offer battle. I still held the upper hand, and even got in a few bursts at the next nearest machine before he threw himself into a vrille and escaped me. The sight of one of their members falling in flames evidently quite discouraged them. Abandoning all their designs on the unsuspecting Spads below, they dived away for Germany and left me the field. I returned to my field, secured a car, and drove immediately up to the lines of our balloon section. I wanted to get my victories confirmed, both this one of today and the Fokker that I had brought down yesterday in the same sector. For no matter how many pilots may have witnessed the bringing down of an enemy plane, official confirmation of their testimony must be obtained from outside witnesses on the ground. Often these are quite impossible to get. In such a case, the victory is not credited to the pilot. Upon the tragic death of Major Lufbery, who at that time was the leading American ace, with 18 victories, the title of American Ace of Aces fell to Lieutenant Paul Frank Bear of Fort Wayne, Indiana, a member of the Lafayette Escadrille 103. Bear then had 9 victories and had never been wounded. Bear is a particularly modest and lovable boy, and curiously enough, he is one of the few fighting pilots I have met who felt a real repugnance in his task of shooting down enemy aviators. When Lufbery fell, Bear's commanding officer, Major William Thaw, called him into the office and talked seriously with him regarding the opportunity before him as America's leading ace. He advised Bear to be cautious and he would go far. 2 days later, Bear was shot down and slightly wounded behind the German lines. Thereafter, Lieutenant Frank Bayliss of New Bedford, Massachusetts, a member of the crack French escadrille of the Sigan, Spad 3, held the American title until he was killed in action on June 12, 1918. Bayliss had 13 victories to his credit. Then David Putnam, another Massachusetts boy, took the lead with 12 victories over enemy airplanes. Putnam, as I have said, was, like Lufbery, shot down in flames but a day or 2 before my last victory. Lieutenant Tobin of San Antonio, Texas, and a member of the 3rd Pursuit Group, of which Major William Thaw was the commanding officer, now had 6 official victories. He led the list. I, for my part, had 5 victories confirmed, but upon receiving confirmation for the 2 Fokkers I had vanquished yesterday and today, I would have my 7 and would lead Tobin by 1. So it was with some little interest and impatience that I set off to try to find ground witnesses of my last 2 battles above San Miguel. Mingled with this natural desire to become the leading fighting ace of America was a haunting superstition that did not leave my mind until the very end of the war. It was that the very possession of this title, Ace of Aces, brought with it the unavoidable doom that had overtaken all its previous holders. I wanted it, and yet I feared to learn that it was mine. In later days, I began to feel that this superstition was almost the heaviest burden that I carried with me into the air. Perhaps it served to redouble my caution and sharpen my fighting senses, but never was I able to forget that the life of the title holder is short. Eating my sandwiches in the car that day, I soon ran through San Miguel and made my way on the main road east to Apremont and then north to Thiaucourt. I knew that there had been a balloon up near there both days and felt certain that their observers must have seen my 2 combats overhead. Unfortunately, the road from Apremont to Thiaucourt was closed, owing to the great number of shell holes and trenches which crisscrossed it. After being lost for 2 hours in the forest which lies between San Miguel and Vignoles, I was finally able to extricate myself and found I had emerged just south of Vignoles. I was about 1 mile south of our trenches, and standing there with map in hand, wondering where to go next to find our balloons, I got an unexpected clue. A sudden flare of flames struck my sight off to the right. Running around the trees, I caught a view of one of our balloons between me and Thiaucourt, completely immersed in flames. Halfway down was a graceful little parachute, beneath which swung the observer as he settled slowly to Mother Earth. And as I gazed, I saw a second balloon 2 or 3 miles further east, towards Pont-à-Mousson, perform the same maneuver. Another of our observers was making the same perilous jump. A sly hiney had slipped across our lines and had made a successful attack upon the 2 balloons, and had made a clean getaway. I saw him climbing up away from the furious gale of anti-aircraft fire, which our gunners were speeding after him. I am afraid my sympathies were almost entirely with the airman as I watched the murderous bursting of Archie all around his machine. At any rate, I realized exactly how he was feeling, with his mixture of satisfaction over the success of his undertaking and of panic over the deadly mess of shrapnel about him. In half an hour I arrived at the balloon site and found them already preparing to go aloft with the second balloon. And at my first question, they smiled and told me they had seen my Fokker of this morning's combat crash in flames. They readily signed the necessary papers to this effect, thus constituting the required confirmation for my last victory. But for the victory of yesterday that I claimed, they told me none of the officers were present who had been there on duty at that time. I must go to the 3rd Balloon Company, just north of Pont-à-Mousson, and there I would find the men I wanted to see. After watching the new balloon get safely launched with a fresh observer in the basket, a process which consumed some 10 or 15 minutes, I retraced my steps and made my way back to my motor. The observer, whom I had seen descending under his parachute, had in the meantime made his return to the company headquarters. He was unhurt and quite enthusiastic over the splendid landing he had made in the trees. Incidentally, I learned that but 2 or 3 such forced descents by parachute from a flaming balloon are permitted any one observer. These jumps are not always so simple, and frequently very serious if not fatal injuries are received in the parachute jump. Seldom does one officer care to risk himself in a balloon basket after his 3rd jump. And this fear for his own safety limits very naturally his service and bravery in that trying business. The American record in this perilous profession is held, I believe, by Lieutenant Phelps of New York, who made 5 successive jumps from a flaming balloon. On my way to the 3rd Balloon Company, I stopped to inquire the road from a group of infantry officers whom I met just north of Pont-à-Mousson. As soon as I stated my business, they unanimously exclaimed that they had all seen my flight above them yesterday and had seen my victim crash near them. After getting them to describe the exact time and place and some of the incidents of the fight, I found that it was indeed my combat that they had witnessed. This was a piece of real luck for me. It ended my researches on the spot. As they were very kindly signing their confirmation, I was thinking to myself, Eddie, you are the American ace of aces. And so I was for the minute. Returning home, I lost no time in putting in my reports. Reed Chambers came up to me and hit me a thump on the back. "Well, Rick," he said, "how does it feel?" "Very fine for the moment, Reed," I replied seriously. "But any other fellow can have the title any time he wants it, so far as I am concerned." I really meant what I was saying. A fortnight later, when Frank Luke began his marvelous balloon strafing, he passed my score in a single jump. Luke, as I have said, was on the same aerodrome with me, being a member of 27 Squadron. His rapid success even brought 27th Squadron ahead of 95 Squadron for a few days. The following day, I witnessed a typical expedition of Luke's from our own aerodrome. Just about dusk on September 16th, Luke left the Major's headquarters and walked over to his machine. As he came out of the door, he pointed out the 2 German observation balloons to the east of our field, both of which could be plainly seen with the naked eye. They were suspended in the sky about 2 miles back of the Boche lines and were perhaps 4 miles apart. "Keep your eyes on these 2 balloons," said Frank as he passed us. "You will see that first one there go up in flames exactly at 7:15, and the other will do likewise at 7:19. We had little idea he would really get either of them, but we all gathered together out in the open as the time grew near and kept our eyes glued to the distant specks in the sky. Suddenly Major Hartney exclaimed, "There goes the first one!" It was true. A tremendous flare of flame lighted up the horizon. We all glanced at our watches. It was exactly on the dot. The intensity of our gaze towards the location of the second Hun balloon may be imagined. It had grown too dusk to distinguish the balloon itself, but we well knew the exact point in the horizon where it hung. Not a word was spoken, as we alternately glanced at the second hands of our watches, and then at the eastern skyline. Almost upon the second, our watching group yelled simultaneously. A small blaze first lit up the point at which we were gazing. Almost instantaneously, another gigantic burst of flames announced to us that the second balloon had been destroyed. It was a most spectacular exhibition. We all stood by on the aerodrome in front of Luke's hangar until 15 minutes later, when we heard through the darkness the hum of his returning motor. His mechanics were shooting up red vari-lights with their pistols to indicate to him the location of our field. With one short circle above the aerodrome, he shut off his motor and made a perfect landing just in front of our group. Laughing and hugely pleased with his success, Luke jumped out and came running over to us to receive our heartiest congratulations. Within a half-hour's absence from the field, Frank Luke had destroyed $100,000 worth of enemy property. He had returned absolutely unscratched. A most extraordinary incident had happened just before Luke had left the ground. Lieutenant Jeffers of my squadron had been out on patrol with the others during the afternoon and did not return with them. I was becoming somewhat anxious about him when I saw a homing airplane coming from the lines towards our field. It was soon revealed as a Spad and was evidently intending to land at our field, but its course appeared to be very peculiar. I watched it gliding steeply down with engine cut off. Instead of making for the field, the pilot, whoever he was, seemed bent upon investigating the valley to the north of us before coming in. If this was Jeff, he was taking a foolish chance, since he had already been out longer than the usual fuel supply could last him. Straight down at the north hillside, the Spad continued its way. I ran out to see what Jeff was trying to do. I had a premonition that everything was not right with him. Just as his machine reached the skyline, I saw him make a sudden effort to redress the plane. It was too late. He slid off a little on his right wing, causing his nose to turn back towards the field, and then he crashed in the fringe of bushes below the edge of the hill. I hurried over to him. Imagine my surprise when I met him walking towards me, no bones broken, but wearing a most sheepish expression on his face. I asked him what in the world was the matter. "Well," he replied, "I might as well admit the truth. I went to sleep coming home and didn't wake up until about 10 feet above the ground. I didn't have time to switch on my engine or even flatten out. I'm afraid I finished the little bus." Extraordinary as this tale seemed, it was nevertheless true. Jeffers had set his course for home at a high elevation over the lines, and cutting off his engine had drifted smoothly along. The soft air and monotonous luxury of motion had lulled him to sleep. Subconsciously, his hand controlled the joystick, or else the splendid equilibrium of the Spad had kept it upon an even keel without control. Like the true old coach horse it was, it kept the stable door in sight and made directly for it. Jeff's awakening might have been in another world, however, if he had not miraculously opened his eyes in the very nick of time. The next day, September 18th, our group suffered a loss that made us feel much vindictiveness as well as sorrow. Lieutenant Heinrichs and Lieutenant John Mitchell, both of 95 Squadron, were out together on patrol when they encountered 6 Fokker machines. They immediately began an attack. Mitchell fired one burst from each gun and then found them both hopelessly jammed. He signaled to Heinrichs that he was out of the battle and started for home. But at that same moment, Heinrichs received a bullet through his engine, which suddenly put it out of action. He was surrounded by enemy planes and some miles back of the German lines. He broke through the enemy line and and began his slow descent. Although it was evident he could not possibly reach our lines, the furious Huns continued swooping upon him, firing again and again as he coasted down. 10 different bullets struck his body in 5 different attacks. He was perfectly defenseless against any of them. He did not lose consciousness, although one bullet shattered his jawbone and bespattered his goggles so that he could not see through the blood. Just before he reached the ground, he managed to push up his goggles with his unwounded arm. The other was hanging limp and worthless by his side. He saw he was fairly into a piece of woodland and some distance within the German lines. He swung away and landed between the trees, turning his machine over as he crashed, but escaping further injury himself. Within an hour or two, he was picked up and taken to a hospital in Metz. After the signing of the armistice, we saw Heinrichs again at the Toul Hospital. He was a mere shell of himself, scarcely recognizable even by his old comrades. A first glance at his shrunken form indicated that he had been horribly neglected by his captors. His story quickly confirmed this suspicion. For the several weeks that he had lain in the Metz hospital, he told us that the Germans had not reset either his jaw or his broken arm. In fact, he had received no medical attention whatsoever. The food given him was bad and infrequent. It was a marvel that he had survived this frightful suffering. In all fairness to the Hun, I think it is his due to say that such an experience as Heinrich suffered rarely came to my attention. In the large hospital in which he was confined, there were but 6 nurses and 2 doctors. They had to care for several scores of wounded. Their natural inclination was to care first for their own people. But how any people calling themselves human could have permitted Heinrich's suffering to go uncared for during all those weeks passes all understanding. Stories of this kind, which occasionally came to our ears, served to steel our hearts against any mercy towards the enemy pilots in our vicinity. And thus does chivalry give way before the horrors of war, even in aviation.